As a result, Australia is also at war.
It is feared that the Prime Minister has drowned.
He has misled the Parliament.
Welcome to the Political History of Australia podcast.
Any boss who sacks anyone for not turning up the day is a bum.
I will not be lectured by this man.
Why won't you call an early election?
Mate, because I want to do you slowly. I want to do you slowly.
With your host, John Ruddick.
Welcome to the Political History of Australia, Episode 11, The James Ruse Revolution. Last week, we saw Captain Arthur Phillip sworn in as the Governor of New South Wales in the fledgling settlement of Sydney Cove. The British flag had been raised, the law was laid down, and what could easily have been a confrontation with the French had been deftly diffused via diplomacy. Governor Phillip could now focus on the massive task at hand, making sure New South Wales would not be just another entry in the long list of failed colonies. Phillip would serve as the Governor of New South Wales from January 1788 until December 1792, almost 5 years, when he returned to England permanently. We're skipping ahead here for a moment, but in 1810, Lachlan Macquarie was sworn in as the colony's governor. More things and places in New South Wales are named in honour of Governor Macquarie than any other person, because his 11 years of leadership put to rest any suggestion that New South Wales was not going to make it. The 22 years, however, between 1788 and 1810 were marked by hunger, insubordination, insecurity, sporadic conflict with some Aboriginals, a couple of rebellions, and what appeared to be generally chaotic conditions. Well, things were definitely institutionally chaotic, but without a strong central state, before too long the people got on and got things done, as we will see in this episode. Historians of the early colonial period are understandably preoccupied with developments within the colony, but almost as though they happened in a bubble. So far in this series, we have seen the exploration and the founding of Australia were very much at the mercy of geopolitical events. An often overlooked but paramount point that needs to be emphasised here is that the geopolitical background to the early colonial period was a little thing known as the French Revolution. The bitter fruit of that colossal upheaval were the French Revolutionary Wars, which then morphed into the Napoleonic Wars. From 1792 to 1815, Europe was convulsed. Around 5 million people died in Europe's fourth most bloody war. England is only 33 kilometres from France, and so during the early colonial period, the statesmen of the British Empire were understandably preoccupied with the defeat of their neighbour, which at its height had conquered mainland Europe. Britain braced for a full-scale French invasion across the English Channel for much of this period. Other European nations flipped sides during that almost quarter-century struggle, but throughout, Britain was the steadfast lead antagonist against the expansionist French. The point of all this is to say that it's almost a surprise Britain bothered caring at all about the little convict experiment on the other side of the globe. It would have been easy for the British to cut their losses on New South Wales so as not to divert further resources and focus on defeating the existential threat on their doorstep. But during the early colonial period, Britain did care and did try its best to maintain support for the fledgling colony. But the geopolitics distracted and limited what they could do. This is a factor in explaining the often quite chaotic conditions until the arrival of Macquarie. This background is worth bearing in mind over the next few episodes, but let's now return to the narrative. Sydney Cove was an open-air jail. The convicts did not wear prisoner uniforms or iron shackles. Supervision was minimal, and in many cases the Marines simply refused to provide any supervision. After a day of labouring, the convicts were relatively free. They built simple huts and many engaged in some type of trade. Many got married and raised families. Yes, many would drink excessively, but the point was that after a day's hard labour, they lived lives that resembled that of free citizens in many ways. The immediate priority was to make New South Wales self-sufficient as quickly as possible. That required mass-scale food production. Yes, they had shipped out 2 years of supplies, but stored food is prone to rot in a warmer climate. And in the pre-refrigeration era, stored food was neither tasty nor nutritious. Phillip knew that hunger foments revolt, so food production was priority one. As we have seen, Phillip insisted on painstaking planning for the First Fleet, and as we've seen, he mostly did an outstanding job. But something rather important had slipped his mind. He needed agricultural know-how. But what he had was military men and urban convicts. It was a dangerous oversight. Farming is a highly skilled profession. To turn land into food requires a vast amount of technical know-how passed from generation to generation. Farming is made far more difficult when you find yourself transported to an alien world where you don't understand the soils, the seasons, the pests, and the cycles of drought and flood, plus a million other things. And it's especially difficult when you have 1,500 mouths to feed and bugger all with any background in farming. 3 decades earlier, Phillip had been married to a wealthy farmer, but she would have had lots of employed labour to work out when to sow and when to reap, etc. On top of that, Phillip had been a public servant for almost all his career. Phillip knew little of farming, little of the laws of supply and demand, and little about how to incentivise commercial productivity. He simply lacked an appreciation that privately owned entrepreneurial farming will deliver higher yields than centrally planned farms. It was a lesson to his credit he would soon learn. As officers and others built little huts around Sydney Cove, they would scratch out a little veggie patch in the adjoining land, but the soil was not especially fertile, and a few veggie patches weren't going to feed so many. For the first couple of years, Phillip just assumed the food would be produced on government-owned and operated farms. Public servants would decide where to clear the land and then what, when and how to produce food. Today's Sydney Botanical Gardens were his first attempt to build state farms, and others popped up in the immediate vicinity of the settlement. Garden Island today is connected to the shoreline after a land reclamation in the 20th century, but in 1788 it was a standalone island and the officers used it as a little farm. Central planning may sound appealing at the conceptual level, but as Stalin, Mao and Robert Mugabe demonstrated, centrally planned farms produce low yields. So surprise, surprise, the infant colony of Sydney Cove was on a highway to Hungary. As early as March 1788, Phillip had ordered food be strictly rationed as the supplies were being depleted and rotting quicker than forecast. Rations were to be applied equally to the convicts and the Marines, which, as we will soon see, stirred resentment among the latter. The rationing got progressively tighter, and the first agricultural results were sorely disappointing. Some tried to hunt but met little success, and the Australian bush isn't teeming with nutritious vegetables. In October 1788, Phillip sent Captain John Hunter aboard the HMAS Sirius to Cape Town and to buy all the food he could pack aboard. It was an 8-month circumnavigation of the world, and the return did alleviate the crisis, but only in the short term. London had received reports of the unfolding food crisis in New South Wales and so sent the HMS Guardian with plenty of food. It left England in September 1789. After buying more provisions in Cape Town, the Guardian hit an iceberg and was so badly damaged it was at serious risk of sinking. The captain ordered most of the supplies to be thrown overboard, which allowed the ship to miraculously limp back over 9 perilous weeks to Cape Town, where the ship was written off and sunk. Back in Sydney, Phillip and the others waited and waited for the Guardian to arrive. When it didn't show up, Phillip sent his biggest ship, the HMAS Sirius, in March 1790 to China to get more food, but it got wrecked on the way when it attempted to land at Norfolk Island. Most aboard survived, but the loss of the colony's only ship big enough to store plenty of supplies was a catastrophe. Rationing was tightened yet again. Things were grim. The period from late 1789 to mid-1790 has been referred to as the starving time. Malnutrition was widespread. Due to the desperation, thieving of supplies increased, and so did the severity of the punishments. Convicts walked into the bush in a desperate bid to find anything to eat, but they found little. In October 1789, Phillip announced daily rations for all would be reduced to 2/3. In April 1790, the rations were now reduced to half the initial amount. At this time, around 100 people had already died of starvation or hunger-related diseases. In that same month, Phillip wrote in his journal that even abiding by the strict rationing regime, they had just a few months left of food. Colony collapse was imminent. Lieutenant General Watkin Tench was a New South Wales Marine. He wrote in his journal,
"Famine was approaching with gigantic strides, and gloom and dejection overspread every countenance. Men abandoned themselves to the most desponding reflections and adopted the most extravagant conjectures. But the misery and horror of such a situation cannot be imparted, even by those who have suffered under it. The insufficiency of our rations soon diminished our execution of labour. Both soldiers and convicts pleaded such loss of strength as to find themselves unable to perform their accustomed tasks. The hours of public work were accordingly shortened, or, rather, every man was ordered to do as much as his strength would permit, and every other possible indulgence was granted.
The Sirius was meant to have been bringing back food, but now they had lost the biggest of their two ships. It was a catastrophe. On the 5th of April 1790, Phillip assembled his top officials and soberly spelt out the grim plight as told by Watkin Tench.
At 6 o'clock in the evening, all the officers of the garrison, both civil and military, were summoned to meet the governor in council, when the nature of our situation was fully discussed, and an account of the provisions yet remaining in store laid before the council by the commissary. This account stated that on the present ration, the public stores contained salt meat sufficient to serve until the 2nd of July, flour until the 20th of August, and rice or peas in lieu of it until the 1st of October.
Phillip sent his only remaining ship capable of a long journey, the HMS Supply, to the Dutch port of Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, to get desperately needed food, which it did, but it wouldn't return until October 1790, and by then they could all be dead. When the HMS Supply was away in June 1790, it appeared the cavalry had arrived. The 6 ships of the Second Fleet began arriving in Sydney Harbour. For months, the people had been desperately scouring the ocean's horizon, looking for a ship, any ship that might have food. They even built an observation post at South Head, where Sydney Harbour meets the ocean, to look for and signal to ships. Watkin Tench described the moment the news swept the colony that a ship had arrived.
On the evening of the 3rd of June, the joyful cry of the "Flags up" resounded in every direction. I was sitting in my hut, musing on our fate, when a confused clamour in the street drew my attention. I opened my door and saw several women with children in their arms running to and fro with distracted looks, congratulating each other and kissing their infants with the most passionate and extravagant marks of fondness. I needed no more, but instantly started out and ran to a hill where, by the assistance of a pocket glass, my hopes were realised. My next-door neighbour, a brother officer, was with me, but we could not speak. We wrung each other by the hand with eyes and hearts overflowing.
The Second Fleet was comprised of 6 ships that had lost touch with each other while at sea, and over the course of 3 weeks from early June 1790, they straggled their way into Sydney Harbour. But as these ships docked at Sydney Cove, it was a borderline horror movie. The British government had contracted slave traders to ship the convicts of the Second Fleet, and they treated the convicts as they were accustomed to treating slaves. Reverend Richard Johnson inspected those who had arrived from the Second Fleet, and he wrote,
"The misery I saw amongst them is indescribable. Their heads, bodies, clothes, blankets were all full of lice. They were wretched, naked, filthy, dirty, lousy, and many of them utterly unable to stand, to creep, or even to stir hand or foot."
Phillip had made transporting convicts to New South Wales look easy, but the poor wretches of the Second Fleet did not enjoy the meticulous planning of the First. The Second Fleet did bring food supplies which were rapturously received, but only enough for short-term relief, and of course, there was now well over another 1,000 mouths to feed. When news of the awful suffering of the Second Fleet reached Britain, the public were horrified. A parliamentary inquiry looked into what went wrong, and there was a determination that it would not happen again. Britain would transport convicts to Australia for 8 decades. The Second Fleet has the worst human rights record of them all. Around a quarter of the convicts aboard the Second Fleet died en route. It gets worse. 40% of those who made it died within 6 months of arriving in Sydney Cove. Now, we should pause here to note the Second Fleet did include 2 arrivals with importance to the early politics of Australia. Darcy Wentworth was a surgeon who had a gambling problem in London. 4 times he was brought to trial for robbing those who owed him gambling debts. He was acquitted each time, but his reputation was now stained. so he took a punt on making a new life for himself far away from England. Darcy Wentworth applied to go to India, but they already had plenty of surgeons. New South Wales, on the other hand, was in desperate need of medicos, and so New South Wales it was. While aboard the Second Fleet, Darcy and a female convict began a relationship, and in 1790 they had a son, William Wentworth, one of the giants of 19th century Australian politics. The other notable arrival aboard the Second Fleet was a young lieutenant, John MacArthur, along with his wife Elizabeth. And in coming chapters, we will soon see the good, the bad, and the ugly associated with John MacArthur. Anyway, back to the narrative. So we're now in mid-1790. The colony is 2.5 years old. Many people are dying from hunger and hunger-related diseases. Scurvy was happily near absent while aboard the First Fleet, but scurvy was now a thing in the colony. Phillip wrote to London about the, quote, great distress the scarcity of provisions had created. Watt Contention 1790 described the colony as a, quote, a country and a place so forbidding and so hateful as to only merit execration and curses. The threat of widespread famine was already at the doorstep, and now the horror of the Second Fleet, good in the immediate term but bad after that, magnified the misery. If there was a betting market on whether New South Wales would make it, the bookies would have been offering long odds on success. But we know it all did become a stupendous success. How? One word: Parramatta. Phillip did thankfully think to bring out one person because of his farm management experience, Henry Dodd. Phillip had known Dodd from way back in the 1760s, when he was a manager on the farm owned by Phillip's ex-wife. The shoreline around Sydney Harbour was okay for some small-scale farming, but this colony needed the mass production of wheat, oats, corn and livestock. In November 1788, Phillip sent Dodd west along the harbour on a scouting mission. After about 20 kilometres, the harbour turns into the biggest river that flows into the harbour. The area was initially named Rose Hill, but the local Aboriginals informed the British they called it Parramatta, and so Parramatta it was. It escapes our thinking, but so many suburbs of Sydney, and indeed towns and suburbs across Australia, are Aboriginal names. Wallara, Kirribilli, Cronulla, Turramurra, Bondi, Woolloomooloo, Camaray, Wahroonga, Cabramatta, Toowoomba, Kalgoorlie, and on it goes, including our nation's capital, Canberra. This hints that there was more goodwill than we appreciate between the first Australians and these new Australians in the early days. Today, Parramatta is geographically the centre of metropolitan Sydney, and it was there Dodd found rich soils as far as the eye could see. And so along with 100 convicts and a few Marines, they got to work on clearing land in an attempt to make a government-owned and operated farm produce food at Parramatta. On the 12th of February 1790, Phillip wrote to Lord Sydney,
I had the honour of informing your lordship that a settlement was intended to be made at a place I named Rose Hill. At the head of this harbour there is a creek, which, at half flood, has water for large boats to go 3 miles up. And 1 mile higher the water is fresh, and the soil's good. A very industrious man, whom I brought from England, is employed there at present, and has under his direction 100 convicts, who are employed in clearing and cultivating the ground. A barn, granary, and other necessary buildings are erected, and 27 acres in corn promise a good crop. The soil is good, and the country for 20 miles to the westward, which is as far as I have examined, lies well for cultivation. But even there the labor of clearing the ground is very great, and I have seen none that can be cultivated without cutting down the timber, except some few particular spots.
So Phillip was sounding upbeat, and yes, Rose Hill Parramatta did have great potential, but again, this was an attempt at government-run farming, and despite the potential, the results were mediocre, until the James Ruse Revolution. So who was James Ruse? Well, he's the father of mass agriculture in Australia. James Ruse was born in 1759 in Cornwall. He was a poor farmer who at the age of 23 got in a little hometown jam and was sentenced to a 7-year term for theft. Ruse arrived as part of the First Fleet. A year into Dodd's efforts in Parramatta, Ruse was assigned to be one of the convict labourers on the government farm. It was November 1789. Now, Ruse had a good eye for agricultural potential, and his eyes lit up when he saw Parramatta. Ruse made a pitch to Governor Phillip. He requested he be given a plot of land to demonstrate his farming skill, but insisted that he farm it as he see fit and not be subject to any government directives. Phillip was curious, and he agreed to this test case. As Ruse was still under sentence, he was unable to legally own land, but for all intents and purposes, he was the boss, making it effectively the first land grant in New South Wales. Ruse was given a tiny 1.5 acres. It was called Experiment Farm, and the experiment worked. By early 1791, Ruse had demonstrated he could grow a bumper harvest of wheat and maize, plus raise some cows and chickens. Seeing a good thing, Phillip upgraded Ruse from 1.5 acres to 30 acres and gave him his freedom and his legal title on the same day. Phillip's first pardon was only weeks after the first Australia Day, when John Irving, who excelled as a surgeon's assistant, was given an absolute pardon. But the whole thing about New South Wales was that it was a prison colony, and so Phillip didn't want to be seen in the very early days to be handing out pardons willy-nilly. He now had a change of heart when it came to pardons. The success of the Ruse experiment could have inspired a lesser man than Phillip to seize Ruse's farm on behalf of the government. But Phillip effectively decided, hey, we need to give the good convicts freedom and land ASAP. We don't want one James Ruse, we want 1,000. And that's what happened. Nothing cuts through bureaucratic malaise like a solution to the hunger crisis. Dodd died in 1791 and Ruse was replaced as the overseer of the Parramatta agricultural efforts. It was effectively the first privatisation program in Australian history. The good famine-ending news kept coming. The Third Fleet arrived in mid-1791 with 2,000 convicts, but this time they were in mostly good health and they brought a ton of food. Remember the bitterness of the East India Company regarding the establishment of New South Wales? While they were moaning about the whole thing, the British government gave the company a concession. New South Wales would be barred from trading with Asia, but the truth is they had little to trade in the early years. The first to break the trade embargo was a ship, the Philadelphia, which sailed into Sydney Harbour in November 1792. It flew an American flag, but was suspected of actually being a British ship that was acting as a smuggler. The Philadelphia brought in beef, ham, tobacco, wine and furniture, and was paid in barter with agricultural produce from Parramatta. From that point, foreign trade ships from all sorts of places were coming and going, and the East India Company could not do a thing about it. Parramatta was the saviour of the colony, and so Phillip built a second government house in the area. It is Australia's oldest public building still standing, and is known today as Old Government House. It is a UNESCO World Heritage listed site. John MacArthur, who we mentioned earlier, is today regarded as the pioneer of the Australian wool industry. MacArthur got his start in farming in Parramatta in 1793, and being an officer was given a huge 100-acre land grant to kick things off. The success of Parramatta was then replicated a few kilometres west at Toongabbie, and then from 1794 onwards along the nearby Hawkesbury Nepean River, with its very rich alluvial soils. Within a year or two, the little settlements of Windsor and Richmond on that river were known as the granary of the colony. By 1795, food rationing was dropped entirely. More and more convicts were freed and given free land. More and more free settlers arrived and given free land. More and more military figures, high and low rank, and other officials chose to remain in the colony when their term of employment expired, so that they too could give farming a go. Phillip would give them seeds, plants, livestock and tools so they could get to work as farmers. More than a few freed convicts became rich. New South Wales was becoming an upwardly mobile society. Most officers, but likely not Phillip, took convict mistresses, a mutually beneficial arrangement often resulting in marriage and families. Freed convicts would become known as emancipists. An unmarried emancipist was typically granted land of around 30 acres, a married one getting around 50. A free settler could expect 100 to 1,000 acres. An officer could get up to 10,000 acres. There were some poor seasons because of droughts and floods, but by 1800 the fear of famine was well and truly replaced by an entrepreneurial frenzy to grow rich via farming. The lack of official currency meant barter became the lifeblood of the economy, and while barter is an imperfect form of exchange, it can be argued it is the most pure form of free market exchange. Value is exchanged for value as determined by two consenting adults. Many former convicts and others grew rich. And by the 1810s, New South Wales was a net exporter of produce. Let's now have a look at how the legal system was functioning in the early colony. In February 1788, 6 convicts were caught stealing and sentenced to death by the criminal court. The ringleader, Thomas Barrett, was hung, but the others were given a reprieve and ordered to live for a period on a harbour island with only bread and water. Theft of supplies was a serious offence, and a message had to be sent. But this little story also demonstrates that Philip wanted to be known more for his belief in the rehabilitation of convicts than for his strict application of inhumane laws. No story better illustrates this than that of Henry and Susanna Cable. In 1783, 20-year-old Henry Cable was convicted of theft and sentenced to death in England. That was then commuted to transportation to America with a 14-year term. But when America was shut to British convicts, Henry was one of those long-suffering convicts in limbo and languishing in a jail. While in jail, Henry started a relationship with Susanna, who was also guilty of theft and also sentenced to 14 years transportation to America. Henry and Susanna had a baby in jail. Unlike today, England in the 1780s had mixed gender jails. When Philip was preparing the first fleet, he worked out that there was too few female convicts, and so Susanna was told that she would be sent to Botany Bay. As there were already too many men, Henry would remain where he was. When Susanna boarded the convict ship with her baby in arm, the ship's captain said only her name was on the list, and the baby therefore was not permitted aboard. According to the captain, the baby would have to stay in jail with Henry, in England. Like any mother would, Susanna put on a performance, and the press took an especial interest in these unfortunate circumstances. That generated public sympathy. A minor celebrity, a stage actor, Mrs. Jackson, started a fundraising drive and appealed in person to none other than Lord Sydney himself, urging him to allow the baby and the father to also travel to Botany Bay. Lord Sydney agreed, and the good news kept coming. The fundraising appeal had raised a significant sum, about 2 years' worth of a labourer's pay. That money was used by Susanna and Henry to buy a parcel of goods to make life easier for them in New South Wales. The family of 3 sailed together, but the goods were stowed on another ship, and somewhere between Portsmouth and Port Jackson, the goods were plundered. At the second church service in New South Wales on the 10th of February 1788, Henry and Susanna were married along with 5 other couples. A few months later in July, there was the first day of hearings in the civil court of the colony, and the first case to be heard was that of the Cables, who was suing the captain of the ship that was meant to have cared for their parcel of goods. The Cables won and were awarded generous damages, £15. What is most significant about the Cable case is that convicts in England had no right to sue over civil matters. But Philip put that detail aside and let the case proceed. This story has been told as evidence that English law arrived in New South Wales with the First Fleet, which is true, but Philip's generosity to convicts was even more pro-convict rights than English law. To round out the Cable story, Philip took a liking to them. Henry was appointed an overseer of his fellow convicts, and he was granted his freedom in 1794, along with a parcel of land around modern-day Petersham. He went on to become a prosperous merchant, shipbuilder and significant landholder. He died in 1846 at his farm near Windsor. He and Susanna left 11 children, and on the bicentenary of their wedding in 1988, 500 descendants attended a mass family reunion. Philip's sympathetic approach to convicts incentivised good behaviour, and by and large that paid off. As we will see next episode, Philip's trouble was not with the convicts. It was with the military.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Political History of Australia podcast with your host, John Ruddick. Click follow to receive episode notifications, and leaving a review helps others find the podcast.